What it do, and what a day it is ahead of week 10 of the NFL season. It's time for the fantasy spin, and we get the week kicked off with a fantastic football game. Cincinnati and Baltimore, so many fantasy points on the line in a busy weekend as you start to build the momentum towards the fantasy football playoffs. I'm JJ Buck. We got Steven Masterson, Aaron Hernandez ready to rock here on the Three Dudes Fantasy Football Show. And speaking of ready to rock, Christian McCaffery, the number one overall pick for the majority of people. You've sat on him. You've had to wait. When is he coming back? All signs are pointing to a return for Christian McCaffrey. 49ers hosting the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Finally, time in week 10. I know a question I've been getting a lot. I'm sure you guys are as well. Do you start Christian McCaffrey right away after an extended absence, missing a lot of games? And I want to give you some other players that are big time players that missed games and came right back to really help you answer this question. But before that, what is the answer to that question?
Yes. What's your answer,
No.
Aaron? Aaron would be the
Yes.
guy who told you. He told me not to start Puka too. So
The answer to that question is yes. And when you wait on a big name player, you put them right back in your lineup, especially Christian McCaffrey, because this is a game changing, team changing, season altering type of move in week 10 of the fantasy football season. Getting back, and Christian McCaffrey is going to hit the ground running. Other players we've seen miss time this year and come back and immediately make an impact. Let's go with A.J. Brown. Got hurt early in the season. He ended up missing 4 games, but 5 weeks overall because Philadelphia had a bye week. In their first game back for A.J. Brown, 6 for 116 and a touchdown, 23.6 fantasy points. Speaking of Puka Nacua, who missed 5 games, 6 weeks total. He came back first game, 7 catches, 106 yards, 18.1 points. Another one that I wanted to throw in there because it was a serious injury, but came back week 1 of his performance. But it was Nick Chubb. It was on the PUP list to start the season. It was 6 weeks missed. He returned. He got 11 carries on that first game. The touchdown saved him, but 11 carries, 20 yards, and a touchdown. And then also Tua. Now it's a starting quarterback, but he comes off his injury, missed 4 games, 5 weeks overall, those for 235 yards and a touchdown. Had 14.6 points. But all this is to say that when it comes to star players, when it comes to starters, whether it's a wide receiver, a running back, if they missed time, you got to put them back in your lineup. And we go to the guy on this show, the guy that has been sitting on Christian McCaffrey. How does it feel now, Steve, to have the decision to actually put Christian McCaffrey in our lineup?
well, it feels great because I am sitting there with Christian McCaffrey for 10 weeks. I mean, 9 weeks, and just kind of going. Honestly, my goal through those 9 weeks was to try to go as close to 500 as possible. I went 4-5, and am still in the playoff hunt, right? So you drafted Christian McCaffrey hoping he'd be a difference maker. So I luckily had Jordan Mason, so I was able to kind of, fill the role. But that's where I'm going to put CMC, and even him coming back and only maybe getting 12 touches, which is what Nick Chubb got. I still expect those 12 touches to be value touches, and I expect him to have maybe not a great game, but a good game. They're not going to bring him back for him to sit, and it's what we saw with Puka. You don't sit your studs. Like, they're going to make a play here and there. So I'm excited to see what he can do. I mean,
And the value in the pass game with, Brandon Ayuk going down. Yes, you saw in Debo Samuel limited in practice midweek to this point. It's the easy touches he's going to get in the pass game too.
yeah, and CMC is that guy. Like, we see their offense just looks a lot better when he's in, because he either gets more people in the box, or they have to lighten the box because they're getting beat over the top, and then he gets quick passes, like you said, out of the backfield, and he can turn those plays into 60-yard touchdowns. So he's that player He's a difference maker. He got drafted number 1 overall for a reason.
Oh, yeah, he did. A lot of owners can't really afford to not put him in the lineup in, just about every league. So, he's going to be out there. He will be limited. It's like there is some expectations to be tempered, but he's like both of you said, there's too much there to not really have him in your lineup.
And I think sometimes, with fantasy football, there's, sit there throughout the week. We do a show, we listen to other shows, we read things, the rankings, like simplify it. Like the dudes that are star players, like don't overthink it, even if they're coming off injury, like put them in your lineup because if they come up short, well, all right, it just happened that way. But if you're sitting and Puka comes back out, and he has 18 fantasy points, or AJ Brown, you're like, well, I don't know, it's a hamstring injury, maybe want to take it, and then 6 for 116 and a touchdown that first game back. Like trust your studs, like keep it simple. Sometimes you don't need to overthink. And Aaron, you're right. It's are you expecting CMC to drop 25 points? No, but you can't not play the dude, especially when you've waited this long. If you took a chance on him at 1 or 2 in your draft, like now's the time where you can get him off that IR position and put him right in. And also, too, you look at what it could do overall for where the 49ers offense is. You mentioned Brandon Ayuk being out. Deebo Samuel has been banged up. What do you think that does also for Brock Purdy moving forward, who's had his spike weeks? But then, Kittle, Deebo, CMC, now these 3 vying, in that target tree.
I definitely see Brock Purdy kind of getting more consistent because he's had those spikes, and it's kind of been one player championing all of his touchdowns in a sense. I do think now that he has the opportunity to throw the ball out of the backfield. To CMC definitely changes the way that whole dynamic of the offense is. So it'll be nice to kind of see it get to where it kind of was previously, and hopefully it improves because that's kind of something that I've seen and I've kind of hoped for with Brock Purdy. So we'll see if he gets to a little bit more consistent play. They do have a tough schedule for passing, but I think he'll be able to weather that storm.
From a pure football standpoint, CMC does 2 things, right? It makes it so you can't rush as hard because you don't really want to leave a linebacker in an island, so you're more likely to play some zone. But he's also going to create play action passes because you have to trust that if they hand it off, like you need to fill the gap because CMC can take it to a house. And it opens up those George Kittle passes, those over the middle, right behind linebacker passes that he has been doing well on all season. So, Christian McCaffery makes Brock Purdy better purely because he makes the offense better. And when the offense is better and play action passing is working, that's where Brock Purdy's the best. And that's kind of what we wanted to see. They didn't fear Mason coming out of the backfield. Catching. That wasn't his game. So if you really watch, a lot of the time they'd send an extra blitzer, and go, he's not going to catch this out of the backfield. It doesn't matter. And we kind of saw that. So Christian McCaffrey gives them another receiving threat that, hey, he has no problem going, hey, this blitzer's coming in free. Just hit me out of the backfield. I'll take it to the house. And we didn't see that with Mason. So one quick joke we have to make. If you don't start Christian McCaffrey this week, he's going to sit on your bench with 25 points. And if you do start him, he's going to sit in your lineup with 3. So, don't be the one who misses out on 25.
Yeah, this is, and to me, I think the biggest beneficiary, other than people finally getting a start, someone they probably picked number 1 overall in their fantasy draft, it is Brock Purdy. And, the 2 of the last 3 weeks, he's been living off his rushing totals. And he had that game against Dallas before the bye week. He had 56 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown. You go to the game against Kansas City, 33 interceptions, but he ran the football into the end zone twice. And so he saw more of that from Brock Purdy, where, all right, you lose some of the, I think, the rushing upside with Brock, but you get more of that passing game consistency like we saw in Seattle. And this was in that same 3-game stretch before the bye week. He had 3 touchdown passes 255 yards passing. So I think, this could probably put Brock Purdy more at the player that we are expecting him to be, flirting with the top 10, a weekly starter where, this guy can give you 250 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and then maybe 20 or 30 yards on the ground. And then you're sitting there with almost 20 points from your quarterback, and that's fantastic. So yes, it's CMC getting back in your lineup, but I think if you picked up Brock Purdy, someone did in here, like this is a dude that I think is going to be really consistent the rest of the way, and it's also a quarterback. And I know you mentioned Aaron. There's some tough matchups in there. Yeah, they're on the road, Green Bay, Buffalo, but they're also in good environments. Late in the season, at Miami. Don't have to worry about a weather game in the fantasy football playoffs. Detroit, which could be a high-scoring affair right there in Week 17. He doesn't have a bye week the rest of the way, and that's also one of the things that at this point in the season, with the new schedule, you get a bye week sometimes. Some of these teams have like Week 14 buys, and that could throw a wrench in your schedule. And San Francisco is a team that, coming off their bye, getting healthy, like they could be one of the big difference makers for teams to win a fantasy championship.
Definitely.
Yeah, and like you said, most of the people who had Christian McCaffery, they can't handle a Week 14 bye at this point because it's really going to come down to Week 14. Like, do I win that game? And that's how I make the playoffs or not. So you're not wrong. And Brock Purdy's another good call. Like, hey, sneak him before Lamar Jackson's Week 14 bye or anything along those lines.
When you have one of those late season buys with quarterbacks, you definitely need to be planning right now for one of those. And that's what I wanted to dive into and kind of focus on a team that's really finding their stride and another team that doesn't have a bye week the rest of the way, that has a lot of players that could be available to put on your team because you're just trying to find every advantage, every option you can at this point in the season. I want to talk about charging up your fantasy football team. I tried to jump on the bandwagon, missed out on it this week, but Justin Herbert, the neutral pass rate is going up and up and up. That offense is starting to find its stride. Greg Roman trusting in his playmakers, in the fact that Justin Herbert is that dude. Like, he is one of the best quarterbacks in the league overall, and he had 275 yards or more passing 3 straight games. Like I said, you don't have to worry about the bye week. And this is a team that is 4th the last 4 weeks in neutral pass rate. So that means passes on first and second down, regardless of the situation, they're pushing the football downfield. And I know Herbert started to tick up over the last couple weeks, but he is definitely a quarterback that, in the mold of Brock Purdy, that can be someone that is steady, has some spike weeks for you the rest of the way. At this point in time, J.K. Dobbins has to be a lineup block for you. The guy is 5 games with 16 plus PPR points, and he's not even a pass catcher. But what I really wanted to talk to you guys about is the flex opportunities, some of the boom or bust nature about the passing options. I think most people have probably sat on Ladd McConkey, but in reality, he's more like a wide receiver 3. He had that spike week, had 30 points against New Orleans a couple weeks ago, 6 for 111 and 2 touchdowns. But kind of Cleveland is more what I think we get out of him, 5 for 64 in that range. But guys that are available, it's Quentin Johnson, who's the ultimate kind of boom or bust flex play. Josh Palmer, who's a low floor, not necessarily a high ceiling guy, but if you're looking, hey, can he get 10 points? I do want to talk about this passing game because it's getting better. Justin Herbert is throwing the football at a high rate. It's passing for a high number of yards. And at some point in time, these receivers are going to come in with touchdowns. How do you feel about kind of taking chances on the edges, finding that wide receiver through that flex with the Chargers moving forward?
The Chargers they're a hard team for me, right? So the last 2 games, they've played the Saints and the Browns. So they're going to look a little bit better because we know those teams aren't fantastic. They play the Titans this week. So again, another weak matchup. Then they kind of get into the meat of their schedule, right? They're going to play the Bengals, the Ravens, the Falcons, and the Chiefs. But that's up until week 14. The playoffs, so fantasy football playoffs, then they're playing the Buccaneers, the Broncos, and then championship, if you make it, the Patriots. So you have a really rough 4-game stretch coming up where I could see them not being the best after this week. So they do play the Titans. They play that the Bengals, the Ravens, the Falcons, the Chiefs. That's going to be rough. Yeah, but
None
it's
of the
also
close plays they've given up this season.
it's one of those things where I think sometimes we're like, oh, they're terrible, but they're not as bad as I think we're saying they are. It's a lot. It's one of those things you're going to get garbage time points because they're up 42-10. But they have such an easy schedule in the playoffs that I want to take a chance on those guys, even if I have to sit them for that 4-week stretch. So that's why I struggle with them. I really, if I'm like,
Atlanta is an absolute like smash spot. Like if Baker Mayfield is going to get you in a shootout, like I trust that. Kansas City don't have expectations for that game.
No.
But you're what you're talking about is these are the things we need to start thinking about.
yep.
Is those last 3 weeks of the season, like dream big, look at those matchups in the
And
playoffs.
the only one that could be iffy is the Broncos, just because Pat Surtain has been locked down to the number one receiver on the other team. But he's probably not following Lad McConkey. So
Yeah, that's an interesting one to see because I kind of feel like you, Steve. I still think Tennessee and the Broncos are kind of a interesting matchup for them. I can see a lot of passing in that schedule, but it's definitely interesting because I haven't watched too much Chargers football. I'm not gonna lie, but they have been catching my eye here. That they've kind of gone on their little offensive run because I didn't have high hopes on the Chargers offense at all. But look at where we are in the season. So like JJ had said, they're they're gelling. They've gotten things together. So it's like I'm kind of with it if I can find them. Add them to my team, trade for them. I'm kind of there with that schedule because I did look at that. I've been looking myself at playoffs and the later week schedules and how it's going with people. We kind of looking at trades because the trade deadline for fantasy for most people is coming up. NFL just finished their trade deadline, so we're in the we're in the deep of it.
17 trades were made at the NFL trade deadline, and we've discussed a lot of them. And I will say, the DeAndre Hopkins trade is hitting a lot better than I thought it would. The fact that DeAndre Hopkins, because I saw this stat and it blew my mind, is the first Kansas City wide receiver to catch 2 touchdown passes in a game since Tyreek Hill. Like that has been a seamless transition. I was expecting Nuke to be fine, but we're talking to like this is wide receiver 2 level stuff. Like is gonna win some games for you down the stretch.
yeah, if you were up on that last week when that happened, you probably are stoked that he's on your team right now.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Oh,
How about the
woke
fact?
up early enough?
So I saw this narrative too out there, and everyone was crushing the Giants, right? They moved on from Saquon Barkley, and everyone was watching Hard Knocks, like, oh, Saquon wants to be there. How can you do that? The Tennessee Titans had Derrick Henry and Nuke Hopkins on their team, and these guys
And
look
AJ Brown
like
at one
five.
point.
Yeah,
Well, I'm just talking last year.
Yeah, that's a good
They
point.
had
Okay.
DeAndre Hopkins and Derrick Henry on their team, and they immediately get out of Tennessee, and they look 5 years younger, both of them.
And they went to Super Bowl contending teams.
So yes,
I mean,
it's
that is fair.
around you, but there was obviously still talent to be used there because Nuke Hopkins looked like he was washed in Tennessee. I understand that it was Will Levis and it was Mason Rudolph that were throwing him the football, but my goodness, you get rejuvenated. It's the Amari Cooper and Buffalo effect. That first game you had. Now, if he can get over his wrist injury, how about Devontae Adams finally showing up last week? We'll keep an eye on Deontay Johnson now in that Baltimore passing game. But these wide receivers, I was a little bullish on those moves. But man, how you guys feeling now that we've seen a couple weeks from some of them, and then even Deontay Johnson now moving forward in Baltimore?
I am surprised as much as you are. I mean, we had talked about it on the show like last time we got together, and we had said we expected him to be DeAndre Hopkins, not Nuke Hopkins, and he's becoming Nuke Hopkins. And I'm like, wow, this dude does look 5 years younger. He looks amazing. Deontay Johnson, I have no clue. Like Zay Flowers looks so good, right? Like it's one thing
so
when you're like,
weird.
yeah, when you look at some of the other teams, you're like, oh, they had no receivers. So yeah, it makes sense that these guys are coming in and looking great. But I don't know what's going to happen with Deontay. I want to think he'll be great, but it's such a weird target share. That whole passing offense has been weird, right? Like Mark Andrews hasn't been fantastic, or he has spike weeks, and Zay Flowers has been the guy, and Derrick Henry's getting a ton of play. I have no clue how to do that. Deontay is probably sitting on my bench until I start to see like he's getting consistent looks.
Yeah, he only played 17 snaps, which it made sense. It's coming in and tough, but that is just a depth move, man. It's a team that has Super Bowl expectation. They didn't have to pay up, and now all of a sudden you already have seen Lamar Jackson be dominant in the pass game, and it's like, okay, well, Bateman's been solid and had his moments. You put Deontay Johnson. That's just a straight football move. That is the one it will be harder, as you said, Steve, down the stretch to maybe see a fantasy impact from. But that's just straight football. We're good. We're just gonna get that much better because they can and have the depth.
They're just trying to stay stride for stride with the Chiefs. That's how I read that. It's like you guys improved your offense, where we're going to try to improve ours. We already think that ours is better in probably their opinion. So it's going to be an interesting playoff.
Yeah, it's going to be
Deontay, from like a fantasy perspective, does suck though, because he was starting to come on so strong in Carolina. Like he became like a lineup lock, and then he had the hamstring injury, and so you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
The hamstring injury. I have to. Everybody seems to have they all get a hamstring injury right before they get traded.
Right before they go somewhere. Speaking of trades and coming on, the last we saw, the New York Jets and Aaron Rodgers had themselves a pretty good game. Halloween against the Houston Texans, and Aaron Rodgers, someone that could be on the map if you need a quarterback. But really, this conversation is about Garrett Wilson. And at what point in time is Steve going to acknowledge that Garrett
He's had some great weeks. I 100% will acknowledge he's had some great weeks. And he's wide receiver 5 right now. So I'm not going to say, like, oh, there goes Aaron.
He's so shocked that you said something positive about Garrett Wilson.
That really was it. I knocked the camp because I couldn't believe what Steve said.
I cannot believe what you're saying about Garrett Wilson.
I mean, he has had good weeks. I can't say he hasn't. Like, that would be, I'm not going to lie. I said he wasn't going to be as good as what he was drafted. And for the first few weeks of the season, I looked right. He's come on strong, and I can't say anything about it. Good for everybody who drafted him. You know what I mean? Like, up until 3 weeks ago, we were saying he was not. He shouldn't have been drafted where he was, and then he's had 3 really solid. Yeah, he's had 3 really solid weeks, and he's made his numbers look fantastic.
I don't know, man. That's you go back to week 5, you're up to 29 points. Week 6, 24. Your down game is 14 and 16, and then a 30-point performance.
Like I said, he's getting hot. When we were talking about this, I was saying he got drafted as the wide receiver. He got drafted where he's at right now, wide receiver 5.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not where he was performing up until recently. He had that 29-point game. Yeah, Devontae Adams has made a big difference. He's not getting all the coverage.
Yep.
So I still stand on the point up until then. Yeah, he had his boom weeks, 29 points. He also had 14 and 16. Like, those aren't what you expect. You expect CeeDee Lamb numbers if you're drafting a receiver in the first round. But now he's performing at CeeDee Lamb level. So great. Fantastic. You're stoked. The Devontae Adams trade has done the opposite of what we were afraid of, which was take targets away from him.
2 blow-up weeks before Adams got there.
My point is still the same. You can say all the things you want. Up until Devontae Adams got there, he wasn't.
And by the way, CeeDee
Lamb, I'm there with Steve.
Had a 40-point game, but he's been performing worse than Garrett Wilson this season.
Yes.
Yeah, Dak. It was a bad example. Honestly, the wide receivers that have performed well are just Jamar Chase and then Justin Jefferson. Like, even Amon-Ra hasn't performed where we expected him to play. So Garrett Wilson looks so much better with Devontae Adams, though. Like, it's awesome, and I'm so happy that he looks good. Like, I'm not mad that he's
You
performing well. I
you
just
should be mad because you
no,
ruined the take.
no, I'm not going to be upset when a fantasy player performs well. I'm not rooting against them. I'm just telling you my opinion.
Oh, he
You
is.
can't root against them if you want. It's okay because you're wearing a Dolphins.
Well, I'm rooting
Yes.
against the Jets, but from a fantasy perspective, I'm never going to like. I have Garrett Wilson on a few teams. That doesn't mean, hey, if he's going to go late second round, I'm going to take the player. Like, mine was just a value based pick. I wasn't going to take him in the top 12. That's not where I had him valued. That didn't mean I didn't have him on my board. It just means I didn't have him where everybody was picking him.
This is like groundbreaking, shocking news in this episode that I was not expecting to hear from Steve.
Well,
I think I have him in our balls and chains league. Like, I'm pretty sure I have Garrett Wilson in that league with you.
I think I agree with Steve. It's like, Garrett Wilson, the expectations were insanely high that he was going to be Devontae Adams 2.0. He was going to have 100 yards every week, a touchdown every week, finish with 17 touchdowns. And it really did not look like that whatsoever until fairly recently. And now that could be the case finally. So it's like it took a little while to kind of get that consistency, and now I think that trade made that happen. So
yeah, I think what we've seen is the wide receiver position it dipped a little bit, and that's why we're talking about running backs so much early in the season, the big performances of those guys. But right now, just in terms of like PPR points, Garrett Wilson is number 2 behind Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and CeeDee Lamb. So it is the guys that you're expecting to be there. And I think one of the things is, especially with Garrett Wilson, is he's only had 1 week where he had single-digit points. Whereas kind of down as we were on him, like that floor has been at least double-digit points. Like it was the Denver game, which the weather was a disaster, and that was a 10-9 loss to the Jets. But I think that's also kind of one of the things you're looking for is what you're talking about, Steve, is that consistency. Maybe it wasn't necessarily seeing the high level consistency from some of these guys, but now you're just looking down the stretch run, and the Jets offense has transformed. You're locked in Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, Breece Hall, but Aaron Rodgers gets interesting, and this is a week where we might have to do some work, guys. We're headed into week 10 where there's up of 9 receivers that could be in your lineup that are on bye. At Green Bay, Seattle, Cleveland, and Las Vegas. Now, Las Vegas is Jacoby Myers come on the last couple weeks. But, Cleveland with the switch to Jameis Winston, all of a sudden, Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy have been a thing. A little bit of Elijah Moore. Seattle, of course, we know with Jack Smith and Jigba was phenomenal last week in the absence of DK Metcalf. But, DK, Tyler Lockett, and then Green Bay, that rotation of wide receivers. So we might be, chasing some spots. We did talk about the Chargers and guys that could still be out there in Quentin Johnson or Josh Palmer to try to find an offense that has upside. But especially this week, what are some teams and or games that have your guys' interest that you might be looking for to fill some of these holes with that many wide receivers out of lineups?
Well, Pittsburgh is always an interesting option for me, just because Russell Wilson has made that passing game look a lot more relevant. And them getting Mike Williams, I don't know what that honestly means. That was a trade target we didn't really talk about, right? The Jets traded Mike Williams to Pittsburgh. So he's a player I'm somewhat interested in, just because they don't have a number 2. And he should fill that role. So if I'm looking at players where I'm like, hey, I need to kind of make a call, I think some of the Bears will make my lineup this week. If I'm desperate, I have no problem looking at Mike Williams, and those kind of guys. Otherwise, you probably can get, unless you have a ton of Green Bay or a ton of like Jacoby Myers, he was probably a waiver pickup for you. So you probably have somebody you can fill that roster spot with. Like I said, if you're desperate, I get it. And those are the guys I'm kind of looking at because they should be able to at least get you some points. I don't know how well they're going to do, right? Mike Williams is kind of a dart throw, but
Dude, just trust me. There's people that are having these questions. I was asked about Jalen Tolbert versus Josh Palmer today by a fantasy manager. So
oh, for sure, yeah.
So at this point, bye weeks, injuries, leaks, there's a ton of stuff, and we're could be scraping the bottom of the barrel. And so a couple of names that I'm interested in, even because we've seen Tampa Bay, Baker Mayfield going to sling it. And it doesn't matter if Chris Godwin and Mike Evans aren't in the lineup, Baker Mayfield going to throw the football. They're still going to be calling passing plays to him. Hopefully you jumped on the Cade Otton bandwagon when we discussed him a few weeks ago moving forward. But in this, hey, do you need someone? Sterling Shepard, 4 for 48. Someone that you could at least give you that somewhat of a PPR floor going into this weekend. I'm not terrified of the matchup against San Francisco because they could be behind. So that means that Baker Mayfield will need to be throwing the football. And so Sterling Shepard can be one of them. And Aaron, I want to talk to you about Jaguars. We know it's Evan Ingram, it's Brian Thomas. But with Christian Kirk being out and Trevor Lawrence, at least from a fantasy perspective, has put like 3 good fantasy weeks together. Is there anything else in that pass game?
Ooh, that one's a tough one. And it's kind of because I made the joke that Trevor Lawrence is the Jaguars' best running back, but the passing game seems like it favors another tight end. I'm not gonna lie. It's Evan Ingram, Brendan Strange. I waiting for Gabe Davis to hop in there and get some catches. It's like Brian Thomas is upset that he's not throwing the ball more and stuff like that. So it's like the Jaguars is a interesting matchup this week with Minnesota. I would even say that if you need players for to put in your lineup, let's look at the Minnesota receivers and TJ Hawkinson and Addison and even Jalen Naylor. I was like they have a favorable matchup in the passing game right there. So it's like you're starting players that are in the center of the field against the Jaguars, and it's proven pretty much every week. So it's like if
it ain't broke, don't try to mess with the strategy.
right.
Just to throw 2 names at you, just because you had mentioned Joshua Palmer. His last 3 games, he's gotten 10, 9, and 14 points, and he's available in like 86% of leagues. So that's a good pull by you. And Alec Pierce, we've talked about him before. He's gotten 7 points and 5 points with Flacco at quarterback. It's not great, but at least it's points.
Opportunity, man. And I do think that because I'm someone that I just look at my team and like, hold up, who am I playing at flex? Because I actually got hit with these bye weeks. Like I have a Raider player, I have a Packer player, I have a Seahawk player, and it's like, okay, so these are the questions I need to be asking. I have 2 names I want to throw out there as we just do this kind of like waiver wire smorgasbord, figure it out week 10 conversation. Mike Gesicki, because T. Higgins is trending to be out again, and for Mike Gesicki, without T. Higgins, he has a 19% target share in that lineup. He just had 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. So we know he can go off. Now, Joe Burrow's not throwing for 5 touchdowns, but it's a short week. It's a Ravens defense that the explosive plays, I don't know the exact number, but it's well over 20 explosive plays that are like 25 plus yards against this team. Gesicki is someone I'm super interested in, even as a potential flex play going into this week. Or guys, he just finds a way. Taysom Hill.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Like this is a New Orleans team that saw Chris Olave go down, and I expect that dude to miss at least a couple games because that's another concussion for him. Unfortunately, they've been in that Rashid Shaheed. It's kind of Alvin Kamara, and then it's going to be the Taysom Hill show. And so if you're just looking at, chances, maybe if you didn't get on the tight end bandwagon, those guys I'm interested in, because look at last week, Taysom Hill had a 17% target share, ran around on 47% of the dropbacks, and oh, by the way, gets carries inside the 10-yard line.
Yeah, he's their goal line back.
Like at some point, like chase the touchdown, right? The touchdown, a couple
Mhm.
receptions, and Taysom Hill can sit there with 12 points for you on the week.
Yeah, and I think Mike Gesicki's a great call, especially if T. Higgins is out. We always talk about the 2 target share. Mike Gesicki is the second one with T. Higgins out. So a lot of people are hurting at tight end. That's not a bad plug and play, especially if you're streaming tight end. So
Yeah, it's been a weird year for tight end. We were so stoked about it early in the season. It kind of fell off because the guys you drafted high, Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, were doing absolutely nothing. Travis Kelce came into his own. Sam Laporta has been hit or miss. Mark Andrews has been up and down. Dalton Kincaid has been up and down. And then it felt like all of a sudden we got some depth the last couple of weeks with Bowers and Cade Otton and Evan Ingram and David Njoku. So it's absolutely been wild at the tight end position. But these are some of the things you got to do, is just start scraping the bottom of the barrel, because there is always opportunity. And one of the things too in this is I'm interested to get your guys' thoughts on it, because I struggle with it at times. I try so much to just focus on matchup and maybe not get caught up in names. Like last week, I had been planning ahead, but I picked up Daniel Jones and I had Matthew Stafford. And I was like, Daniel Jones, he's not that good sometimes. I don't know what I want to do. And I'm like, well, I'm just going with Stafford because he's Matthew Stafford. Stafford had a 17-point game, but Daniel Jones had a 24-point game. And so in the fantasy football world, right, is how do you separate sometimes the real life football conversation where, yeah, if you're telling me Matthew Stafford, Daniel Jones, we're all taking Matthew Stafford. But in fantasy football, like there's an argument that, Daniel Jones is the better option in this scenario. How do you guys handle that, of not letting, sometimes our real life football takes kind of make the fantasy football decision for you?
Man.
quarterback's really the only position that's true with, more than almost anything else, right? Because Patrick Mahomes is by far the best quarterback, but he's not the best fantasy quarterback. Like you could argue for Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen being up there, but we all know Patrick Mahomes is number one, and those guys would probably be the better fantasy quarterback, Jalen Hurts, because they run. I don't really struggle with that issue in other aspects. Like usually if you're a bad receiver, you're probably not getting a ton of targets. You're not going to be on the field too much. Same thing with running backs. Usually bad running backs don't correlate to good.
Mhm.
Trent Richardson, those players come along, right? But
I guess it'd be more about, being able to see value maybe where there's no value. Like the anytime, like any Panthers right now, like is Xavier Legette someone that you can start? You might feel terrible about the Panthers, but he's number one target. Are they going to scheme him in? Things like that too. I guess
that's a good point.
Yeah, that is a good example. I mean, I seem to kind of fall into remembering how awful my team is, and there's still fantasy points there, especially like a quarterback, like going back even to Blake Bortles throwing a ton of touchdowns in garbage time. That's something that happens. He's not great on the field, doesn't look good. There's plenty of other quarterbacks, but it's like, that ability to still have points and even boom sometimes just off of getting beat so bad and just playing catch up forever is something it's tough to separate fantasy from reality. So.
Well, it's honestly the idea behind blind resume. I pick players that are usually have a perception they're on a bad team or they're not good, and we can compare them to other players. So from my perspective, kind of going with what you're saying, right? I understand the concept of what you're trying to get to. I try very, very hard to look at 3 things when I'm looking at like a quarterback. I'm going to look at, okay, what has your team been doing? Are you been behind in so many games that you're passing a lot? And are you turning those into conversions? Are you running with the ball? Even if your team is bad, what are you doing with those carries and those touches and that kind of stuff? Wide receivers, how many targets are you getting? I don't care if you scored 20 points, but you got 3 targets and you just happen to have 3 touchdowns off of it. That's fluky. Touchdowns are fluky. I'm chasing targets because that tells me if the quarterback's looking your way, even if they're not converting those. I had 15 targets. Dude, that guy's eventually going to turn, even if he catches half of those, at 7 points. It's why we were so big on Wan'Dale Robinson when we were talking about it, right? And then running backs, it's just about touches. Like, how many touches are you getting, right? Because touches are valuable. Goal line touches are more valuable. So if you have a guy like Taysom Hill, where, hey, this guy gets the ball inside the 5, he might not turn those all into touchdowns, but sometimes if you get 3 touches in the 5-yard line, if one of those turns into touchdown, that's 6 points. I don't care if you're not doing a lot. Like
Opportunity.
It's Mike Tolbert with LaDainian Tomlinson. That dude seemed to get all the touchdowns. LaDainian gets you to the 1, Tolbert gets you in the end zone. So
did all the work. Too tired. We're gonna just run it with the big giant dude in. It'll be easy.
Touchdown.
See, and it's been difficult for me because kind of what you said, you touched on, Steve, was opportunity and stuff like that. Because it's like, I'll use the Titans as an example with their pass catchers. It's like Hopkins and Calvin Ridley look like complete garbage because their quarterback was complete garbage. I didn't think it would be that bad, but it was incredibly bad where their quarterback was a meme every week. So it's like, I didn't see that happening. But it happens. And it's like, kind of, now we're a little bit, halfway, a little bit more than halfway through the season. It's like, you kind of, you know where you're at, but it's like stuff like that, at the beginning of the season is kind of hard to read into. And I think as time goes on, it becomes a little bit easier to read. So I don't know. That's just how I see things, my take on that, because it's always a struggle.
Yeah, but speaking of Calvin Ridley, with Nuke Hopkins out of town, in the last 2 games, he has 39% and 29% of the target share. So get back on that Calvin Ridley bandwagon.
Mason Rudolph, man.
Mason Rudolph. Chuck and pray. Chuck and pray. Well, that is a great segue. Some of what we just talked about to this with Professor Steve. Wide resume time. And he does want to talk about quarterbacks this week. And it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to look at a sample size of the last 5 games. I know there's a lot of numbers there. So take it away, Professor Steve.
All right, guys. So when we break these down, just understand I'm not making any quarterback look bad. I'm just trying to help you understand there are quarterbacks out there, especially with Dak Prescott going down. And we just talked about, Jordan Love and Geno Smith on bye. 2 of these quarterbacks are available in over 60% of leagues. I compared him to a quarterback that we all think is really good, and everybody on this podcast thinks he's good, but just to help you out a little bit. So we're looking at the last 5 games because 2 of these quarterbacks are coming off of injuries. I was trying to give the best sample size I possibly could here. So we'll start it off. Quarterback one had 1,171 passing yards, has 9 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 22 rushing yards, and 14.6 points per game. Not fantastic, but quarterback 1. Quarterback 2, 1,093 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 185 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and is averaging 21.1 points per game. And quarterback 3, 1,333 passing yards, 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 67 rushing yards per game, or rushing yards, 19.4 points per game. Okay, so here's the surprise. Quarterback 1 is Jordan Love. Jordan Love has had a bad 5-game stretch, right? He's coming off of his injury, so we kind of expect that. He has had one blow-up game, but has not looked fantastic. Quarterback 2 is the biggest surprise to me. That's Bo Nix. Bo Nix is available in 67% of leagues, is throwing at a good enough clip and rushing enough. Like, he's not getting a touchdown every game, but he's gotten a touchdown in 2 of his last 5.
He's been running.
He's been running. He's getting you those 21 points a game. he's had one really bad week and then 2 really good weeks, which has kind of inflated those numbers a little bit. But overall, his last 5 games, he's looking pretty good. Quarterback 3. So I had to give a little context here. Quarterback 3 does go into last season because he is Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson has only played 2 games this season. But in his 2 games this season, he's averaging 19 points. He's had one really good week and one average week. But still, in his last 5 games, 1,300 passing yards, 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's not running a lot in Pittsburgh, so I threw those numbers in there. But 56 of those rushing yards came in one game when he was in Denver. But still, 19.4 points per game. That's been his average. These 2 quarterbacks, Bo Nix and Russell Wilson, they're not going to win you a ton of weeks, but these guys are good enough to get you through this bye week, and should be quarterbacks you're looking at for those deeper, week 14 bye weeks that are coming up, and they're helpful.
And Steelers are a good football team right now. Like, they're playing to win games, and Russell Wilson,
They are
pushing the football down the field with him. And I know a lot of people, when the Steelers made the change, you're 4-2 with Justin Fields. He's the athlete. He has the upside. What are you doing? And it was as simple as they wanted to take more shot plays down the field. They wanted more of that play action game, and that's what they're getting out of Russell Wilson. It's allowed Najee Harris too to continue to have a good season, and I think that's a really good point. These are what we need to be looking at, is guys off the radar that you're going to need, because we have some late bye weeks coming up, and
we just lost Dak.
Dak is down, and some other quarterbacks that have thought we were going to be able to rely on haven't been giving us a solid floor. Like, if Jared Goff is one, like, the Lions are awesome, but like, he had a game where he had 3 touchdown passes, like 80 yards. Like, that's just
so weird.
It's and Joe Burrow, kind of the same thing, a 5 touchdown game, and then he can come back down and have 10 points. So keeping these guys in mind that have upside is absolutely on point with that conversation. And like I said, it kind of goes back to what we just talked about, right? Just finding fantasy points or like anywhere. It's the NFL. Find them.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I was like, Bo Nix and Russell Wilson were 2 that I specifically looked at, kind of looking at buys coming up end of the season, if there's room on my roster, if I could use them and stuff like that. So those are 2 great ones.
Well, and Bo Nix is available in over 60% of leagues, and Russell Wilson is available in 81% of Yahoo leagues. Like, he's not even rostered in 20% of leagues. I'm not expecting him to kill it for you, but I also expect him to be good enough to at least not feel like my quarterback position lost me the week. And if you're just looking to fill a week, right? Like Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills, their bye week is coming up. Those are 2 players I'm probably looking at. Like, which one am I going to pick up? I don't know, but I'll look at the bye week and see what that corresponding quarterbacks, who are they playing that week, and kind of go from there. So those are the types of quarterbacks we should be looking for. It's not about, hey, everybody's saying do this, that, and whatever. Find the quarterback that can help you win a week. That's what we always talk about. You're just trying to win 1 week. That's it.
Yeah, and you look at the Broncos' upcoming schedule. Don't like Bo Nix this week against Kansas City, but the Falcons team that's prone to explosive games. Las Vegas Raiders, Cleveland Browns do have a week 14 bye, but then you get Colts, Chargers, Bengals.
Right.
So that there's definitely playable matchups for Bo Nix, who's a willing runner. Sean Payton is letting him throw the football a ton. While there might not be anyone outside of Cortland Sutton that we're putting on our fantasy teams, Bo Nix is absolutely a fantasy watch list player down the stretch to fill the needs, especially with those late bye weeks. So Professor Steve dropping it with the blind resume. And now it's time to plant your flag. Guys that you're putting in your lineup this week, guys that are going to be in your daily fantasy lineup. Maybe it's a stud who's cooled off a little bit, and you're going to say, hey, pay up on daily fantasy for this guy. He's going to live up to his price tag, or that sleeper under the radar player. Plant your flag. I'll start off this week, and it's a matchup that I've liked to attack this year, and it's who's ever playing the Carolina Panthers. Hello, Germany. Good morning. Here's football. It's a New York Giants. It's a Carolina Panthers. Give me Tyrone Tracy. He's been one of my favorite players this season, the converted wide receiver from Purdue to running back. He has 36 carries the last 2 weeks. He went off for 23 points at the Pittsburgh Steelers. Didn't find the end zone last week, so it was a quiet game against Washington, just 7.9 points, but still had 16 carries. Tracy is going to find the end zone this week. He is the bell cow back over Devin Singletary. Tracy and your Giants, get them in your lineup this weekend.
That's a good one.
I like it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll go next. I'll continue against starting teams, against the cat teams. I'll go with the Minnesota Vikings against Jacksonville. Hawkinson's going to be limited a little bit still, but he's going to be, tight end that you need to get out there. He's someone you're going to play. Addison, definitely. Of course, Justin Jefferson's always a lock, but Addison, and then maybe in deeper, and this is a plant your flag for, I guess, everyone on this team, but even Jalen Naylor in deeper leagues playing the slot. So Jacksonville can't cover the middle of the field, and you're playing everyone against that. So those are my plant the flags.
Aaron and his constant, whoever playing the Jags.
Yep. I'll change, but this one's just too.
It's too good.
It's like Hawkinson's back finally. It's like people want him to be out there scoring, and I think this is the week that he scores.
I'm going to stay on the tight end train. I think this is finally the Dalton Kincaid blow up game. At least that's what I hope is happening. They're playing a bad Indianapolis Colts team against the tight end. I actually am interested in my daily stacking Allen and Kincaid here. I think this could be the last 2 weeks. Kincaid has had 7 and 10 targets. He's getting the targets, which is what we've been talking about. They're just not turning into big points. I think that finally changes. I see Kincaid having a 13 to 15 point game, which from a tight end is fantastic and what I'm kind of looking for. If he gets in the end zone, obviously even more, but I could see him with a 7 for 80-yard game out of him. 7 catches, 80 yards. And Josh Allen is still Josh Allen. I don't mind paying up for him because Indianapolis has not been fantastic. And this could be one of those games where it's a high scoring game and it gets out of hand quickly.
Yeah, and also look at Buffalo. Cooper dealing with an injury. Keon Coleman a little bit banged up. So you got the Qs with those guys. And so you turn your attention to the trusted receivers that have been, the last 6 games of last year going in the playoffs, and this season it's Kincaid and it's Khalil Shakir. Guys in that Bills offense that can definitely go off. And so I like that. Plant your flag this week for week 10 of the NFL season. A lot of good games on deck. Gets going tomorrow. Cincinnati and Baltimore. Plenty of fantasy options. And, the week of just being prepared with Green Bay, Seattle, Cleveland, Las Vegas on bye. So a lot of starters out of the lineup this week with the 4 teams on bye. So pick your spots, and hopefully the conversation just helps you think outside the box a little bit at times of, you can find fantasy points all over the place and sometimes in unexpected places. So you can hit us up as you see on the X. Our personal handles are all on the screen. _ Steven Masterson, _ JJ Buck, at Jax _ 47 for the man himself, Aaron Hernandez. You can like and subscribe, please and thank you, to the 3 Dudes Fantasy Football Show, because we want to be talking to someone at some point in time. You can follow us on the X overall at 3 Dudes FFS. Send us your questions, any thoughts you have, start, sit, you name it. Last second trades, the fantasy football trade deadline right around the corner. And here we go, guys. Another week. Sit back, enjoy some football. So with that being said, any parting thoughts? Anything that is still on your mind that you need to get out before we say goodnight?
Good luck. Hopefully you win this week, and the CMC owners go on a nice little 5-game win streak. Other than that, peace be with you.
Yep. Good luck. It's a jungle out there.
It's a jungle. Get your machete out and cut your way to victory. Victory. That's what we want. We want winners. And may the fantasy odds be in your favor. For the crew, the Professor Steve Masterson, Aaron, I'm JJ Buck, everybody. Memorable peace and love. Thank you for joining us here on the 3 Dudes Fantasy Football Show.
Peace.
Later, y'all.